Hotep, everybody. This is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network and host of the African History Network show. It is Sunday, March 24th, 2024, and we are live. We have a very exciting show for you today. Some of you all have seen the post on my Facebook fan page, the African History Network, my personal Facebook page, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP, and on my Instagram page. So on today's show, we're going to deal with a portion of this interview that Candace Owens, Black conservative grifter Candace Owens, did on the Breakfast Club this past week with Charlemagne the God and DJ Envy. He's gotten over 1 million views on their YouTube channel, on the Breakfast Club YouTube channel. There have been numerous articles written about it. She's talking about she's going to vote for Trump again, even though he incited an insurrection. She talked about how she thought Trump in 2016 would be better for the economy and Republicans in general, better for the economy. All that's false. Okay. What we're going to, so I did a post on our Facebook page, the African History Network, and I talked about how she told so many lies in this interview that I'm going to have to do a multi-part series to break this stuff down. Okay, so this is part one, and I've got a lot of information to get to. What I want to deal with is what she said at 13 minutes and 9 seconds into the interview, dealing with the Great Society programs, President Lyndon Johnson, and African Americans. Okay. So in case you missed it, and ain't much, but in case you missed it, I want to go to exactly what she said. So everybody knows. I want to play an excerpt of this for you to check this out. And one of the biggest problems with a lot of what she said is Charlemagne the God and DJ Envy did not challenge her on it, did not push back, did not provide facts. Let's go to this clip.
Years. And this man is being hailed as a hero because he had to sign the Civil Rights Act, essentially with a figurative gun to his head because the country was on fire. You know, JFK had just died, and there were riots in the streets protesting because of racism. And he did not want to sign it, but he did. And with the other hand, he signed the Great Society Act and incentivized welfarism and, you know, programs to incentivize not marrying Black men. You know, to think that we had government agents knocking on the door, going into the homes of Black women and being like, there better not be a man that lives here. We're just here to check to make sure. If you want this check, dad can't be home. Every other ill that Black America is facing today is because we've removed fathers from the home. So I am like a big, you know, I use my platform to talk about men a lot and the need for male leadership, everything that is so harmful, this, you know, Me Too, false feminism, all of this crap. It's anti-man, and it's anti-man for a reason, because a society cannot survive without strong men. A household cannot survive without strong men. We need strong men to lead homes. And so the fracturing of the Black family, I think, was the test. Like, you know, like we were the mice in the experiment. Like, let's see how that goes. And now they're kind of doing that writ large. And I hate feminism so much. I can't even tell you, because what it's about is it's just an attack on men.
Oh, you just said a lot, Candace. So let's talk about some of these things. Now, you said a lot. Now with the
she talks about feminism. She talks about the, let me stop this clip. She talks about feminism. She talks about the attack on the African-American family. She talks about the importance of Black men. She's not married to one, but she talks about the importance of Black men. I agree. African-American men are important. Okay. And for feminism, there are criticisms that African-Americans have made about feminism, quote unquote, white feminism. Now, let me say this from the start. Women should have equal rights to men. Women should get equal pay to men. Women should have equal rights to men. Women should not be abused. All of that. Okay. There are some areas where a lot of people, a lot of African Americans say, quote unquote, white feminism goes too far. There is some a legitimate case for that. But let's look at this. Let's take this step by step. Okay. All right. So first of all, let's look at, she said that she's talking about President Lyndon Johnson, who was from Texas, who was a U.S. senator from Texas. Before that, he was in the U.S. House of Representatives, right? She said he was a virulent racist. Okay, that's true. Donald Trump is a virulent racist as well, but she doesn't want to call out Donald Trump for his racism. But okay, that's part two. That's the next show. But let's look at this article here from MSNBC.com. And this is nothing new. We've talked about this here on the show before. I've been doing this show 14 years. March 2024 was our 14th year anniversary of me doing the African History Network show. So we talked about this, President Lyndon Johnson here on the show before. We dealt with the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, all of that. We talked about all that here on the show. Lyndon Johnson was a civil rights hero, but also a racist. Lyndon Johnson was a racist. He was also the greatest champion of racial equality to occupy the White House since President Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln's record is flawed. And if you've seen any of my presentations, you've taken my class dealing with Black resistance movements from the year 1800 to 1968. We talk about Lincoln and the Civil War, what leads to the Civil War, things like this. So, yes, it is true that President Lyndon Baines Johnson used the N-word a lot. That is true. And he used variations of the N-word, okay? In Senate cloak rooms and staff meetings, Lyndon Johnson was practically a connoisseur of the N-word, okay? According to Lyndon Baines Johnson biographer Robert Caro, C-A-R-O, Johnson would calibrate his pronunciations by region using, variations of the N-word, okay? We're not going to say it here. Now, discussing civil rights legislation with men like Mississippi Democrat James Eastland, who committed most of his life to defending white supremacy, he'd simply call it the N-word bill. He'd simply call it the N-word bill. Okay, this is what Lyndon Baines Johnson called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Right now, and you study James Eastland of Mississippi. James Eastland of Mississippi, he was in the House of Representatives. I'm sorry, he was in the U.S. Senate. Senator James Eastland of Mississippi. And Eastland had the Confederate battle flag of Northern Virginia in his office. If you ever see a picture of him, just Google Senator James Eastland of Mississippi. Okay. Now, then in 1957, Johnson would help get the N-word bill passed, known as the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The Civil Rights Act of 1957. When the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the segregationists would go to their graves knowing the cause they'd given their lives to had been betrayed, Frank Underwood style, by a man they believed to be one of their own. When Cairo asked segregationist Georgia Democrat Herman Talmadge, now he was another racist, Senator Herman Talmadge, okay, of Georgia. All right, he was another straight up white supremacist. Because these are all former Confederate states: Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, even though Tennessee comes back into the Union in 1862 after seceding in 1861, Texas, Florida, these are all former Confederate states, right? So when Cairo asked segregationist Georgia Democrat Herman Talmadge how he felt when Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act said, quote, "We shall overcome," Talmadge said, quote unquote, "sick." Okay, it made him sick. Now, the Civil Rights Act made it possible for President Lyndon Baines Johnson to smash Jim Crow. The Voting Rights Act made the U.S. government accountable to its African-American citizens and a true democracy for the first time. Now, Johnson lifted racist immigration restrictions designed to preserve a white majority and, by extension, white supremacy. He forced FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, then more concerned with communists and civil rights activists, to turn his attention to crushing the Ku Klux Klan. Though the Fair Housing Act of 1968 never fulfilled its promise to end residential segregation, it took another 20 years for the federal government really to have the teeth to really enforce the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It was another part of a massive effort to live up to the ideas America's founders only half-heartedly believed in, a record surpassed only by Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so you can read the rest of this. Yes, it is true he used the N-word, but he was somebody who could be forced to do the right thing, and this is what happened. Now, she said that he signed the Civil Rights Act after President Kennedy was assassinated. And she said there were riots taking place, things like that. Now, she is correct that he signed the Civil Rights Act after President Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963. That is true. But the Civil Rights Act wasn't signed into law till July 1964. So, yes, there were some rebellions taking place across the country. But the rebellions weren't taking place because Kennedy was assassinated. And you're going to have rebellions from 1964 to 1967. This is true. Okay. But it was pressure. She didn't talk about the pressure coming she really didn't talk about the pressure coming from civil rights activists, the protests, the sit-ins that were taking place. Okay. This is what pushes forcing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to be signed into law. Read this article because I don't have time to get deep into this here. I'm trying to keep this presentation short, like under an hour. I doubt if I'll be able to do that. Read this from history.com. History.com is the official website of the History Channel. Civil Rights Act of 1964. Civil Rights Act of 1964. And something else very interesting I noticed about Candace Owens is when she talks about the Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, things like that. She doesn't really talk about the laws and policies that were put in place that caused the need for those laws in the first place, going back to the collapse of Reconstruction in 1877 and the Compromise of 1877, when Republicans conspired with Democrats to allow Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate for president, to become president because neither Rutherford B. Hayes nor Samuel J. Tilden had enough electoral college votes to become president. And the Republicans agreed that if the Democrats allowed Rutherford B. Hayes to become president, Hayes will remove the Union troops out of the South, which would allow the Southern segregationists to take back control of the state legislatures. So it was a conspiring and state government and local government. So it was a conspiring by both Republicans and Democrats. And when I'm on panel discussions with these Black conservatives, I was on one on the Tammy Mack Late Show with one brother. We were talking about, I think this was dealing with reparations. We got one brother out of California, the California Justice Initiative or something like that, dealing with reparations. We had two Black conservatives, one MAGA conservative, one crazy MAGA conservative, and there's one other brother who was more mature, more refined, but didn't make a lot of sense either. Okay. And when I brought up the collapse of Reconstruction in 1877, they didn't want to discuss that. And this is something that I noticed with a lot of these Black conservatives. They don't want to have that discussion. Okay, we're going to talk about the party realignment in a few minutes here, because that's something else that they want to deal with. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, is considered one of the crowning legislative achievements of the civil rights movement. First proposed by President John F. Kennedy, it survived strong opposition from Southern members of Congress and was then signed into law by President Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson. In subsequent years, Congress expanded the act and passed additional civil rights legislation, such as the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Okay, so then they go through, they talk about some of this history. I don't want to play this video. They talk about some of this history. You can watch the video. The reason why you needed a 1964 Voting Rights Act is because segregation was written into the state constitutions. Okay, after the Civil War ends, after Reconstruction. Okay. And they talk about it right here. You go back and look at the Mississippi State Constitution of 1890, which imposed poll taxes, literacy tests, and segregation. Nonetheless, many states, particularly in the South, use poll taxes, literacy tests, and other measures to keep their African-American citizens essentially disenfranchised. They also enforce strict segregation through Jim Crow laws, and condone violence from white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the other thing that's very interesting is that the second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan, which started in October of 1915, created by the Reverend William Joseph Simmons, after he saw the movie The Birth of a Nation, that had both Republicans and Democrats. The second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan, because most of the early Klan members had died out by 1915. The Klan was not powerful like in 1915. There's going to be a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. And that second incarnation was largely because of the movie The Birth of a Nation that rejuvenated the Ku Klux Klan. You're going to have a second incarnation, and you're going to have both Republicans and Democrats in this. And if you read this article here, there's a good article from the Washington Post that deals with, let's see, I think this is it. Okay, well, you got one from history.com, how the birth of a nation revived the Ku Klux Klan. So read that one. There's also one from a good article from the Washington Post dealing with the Reverend William Joseph Simmons and the Ku Klux Klan. That's the one from Washington Post. I usually cite that one a lot. Yeah, this one right here. A preacher used Christianity to revive the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, so I'm going to show you these articles. I don't have time to get deep into these because I already got about 15 articles that I have to get through dealing specifically with these statements that she made at the 13-minute 9-second mark. But read this piece here from history.com. Now, history.com is the official website of the History Channel. Okay, how the birth of a nation revived the Ku Klux Klan. History.com, how the birth of a nation revived the Ku Klux Klan. D.W. Griffith's controversial epic 1915 film about the Civil War and Reconstruction depicted the Ku Klux Klan as valiant saviors of post-war South ravaged by Northern carpetbaggers and free Black people. Okay, so read this piece here. All right, and this gets deep into the history. All right, now, and I'll post this link here also. And they talk about Thomas Dixon because the movie The Klansman was based upon a novel by a man named Thomas Dixon. Okay, it was actually the Reverend Thomas Dixon, if I remember correctly. All right, so now the piece I was looking for, because I have thousands of articles archived, and I monitor about 35 different news sources on a daily basis. The article that I was looking for was this one right here. This is from the Washington Post. This is from 2018, and it deals with the Reverend William Joseph Simmons. And he is the man who created this second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan, and they held a ceremony on top of Stone Mountain in Georgia. And Stone Mountain in Georgia has the largest Confederate monument of anywhere in this country. I've been to the top. I've climbed Stone Mountain because they have a trailway where you can climb up. People use it for exercise, things like this. And I've been to the top of Stone Mountain. All right. This article right here. The preacher who used Christianity to revive the Ku Klux Klan. Now, I know this probably sounds like a Trump supporter, but no, this is in 1915. Now, this is a good article by Deneen L. Brown. I've read a number of articles by Deneen L. Brown for the Washington Post. It's from April 10th, 2018. Here's a picture of the Reverend William Joseph Simmons. And they talk about 1915, him reviving the Ku Klux Klan, the second incarnation. And they talk about he declared himself Imperial Wizard of the Klan. And they talk about the movie The Birth of a Nation. Okay, so check out this article also. All right, let me post this here. Okay, let's continue. All right, now, I want to go to this piece there was a good article from 2011 from theroot.com. And I'm not a big fan of The Root. I read articles here and there from them. I'm not I've read The Root for years, periodically. They have some good articles here and there. But this one right here by Cynthia Gordy, June 17th, 2011, Welfare, Fathers, and Those Persistent Myths. Welfare, fathers, and those persistent myths. Okay. So this goes through and dispels this myth about the Great Society programs, welfare, and Black men not being in the home, making it illegal for Black men to be in the home. We got this, and I got some other information to show you as well. So let's look at this quickly here, break this down. Welfare, fathers, and those persistent myths. Okay, so they talk about the movie Claudine from 1974, starring Diane Carroll and James Earl Jones. You know, the voice of Darth Vader, James Earl Jones, and Diane Carroll, Dwayne Whitley Gilbert's mother on A Different World. All right, so we've all seen the movie Claudine. All right, and she's on welfare, and she has a boyfriend, and the white social worker comes to the house, and you can't have a man in the home, things like this, right? So they go on to say, urban legends tell of man in the house rules that prohibit men from living under the same roof as moms who receive public assistance. Between media images, half-truths, and also well-meaning but flawed policies, the belief that the welfare system undermines poor families has been entrenched in the public mind for decades. Now, what's interesting, I've heard people throw this myth out. Now, they don't provide any supporting evidence, no supporting documentation. They just throw it out and then people just accept it. Okay, so then they go on, they talk about the Fatherhood Initiative at public housing authorities nationwide, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, etc. If we go down here, let's see, continue reading. I want to go to the section, clearing up misconceptions. Let me scroll down right here, clearing up misconceptions. A particular fact that those giving the side eye to the American welfare system often trot out is that in 1890, married couples headed 80% of all Black households. Married couples headed 80% of all Black households. And you hear a lot of Black conservatives throw this statistic out. Okay, now, yes, times were totally different. I mean, you're talking about 35 years after chattel slavery in 1890. Okay, and I'm an advocate for marriage. I'm an advocate for healthy marriages, not crazy marriages, not dysfunctional marriages. The figure held constant over the next 7 decades through 1960. However, by 1970, after President Lyndon Johnson established social reforms like WIC, the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for women, infants, and children, food stamps, Medicaid, and public housing projects, Black families with mothers and fathers at home had fallen to 64%. Now, we're going to look at the history of WIC, because the WIC legislation actually is in 1972. Is proposed in 1969 under and that would be under the Richard Nixon administration. Okay, because, well, it's 69 under the Richard Nixon administration, because Nixon takes the oath of office January 20th, 1969. We know he runs in 1968 and wins. Lyndon Johnson does not run for re-election in 1968. Okay, so we're going to look at that. She talked about the welfare system starting in the 1950s. Then she said the welfare system, food stamps, all this stuff starts with Lyndon Johnson. Now, in all actuality, and I'm going to show you this, welfare began in 1935 under the Social Security Act of 1935 as part of the New Deal from President Franklin Roosevelt to fight against the Great Depression, because there were so many destitute white people. That's when welfare started. Okay, welfare didn't start with the Great Society programs. Okay, so we have to look at this. I'm going to show you that in just a minute, because I'm a historian. So proper documentation ends all conversation. I understand history. I can provide you with the evidence. I'm listening to Candace Owens. I can tell she does not understand history. And that's why when you listen to her, usually, like in these interviews, she doesn't provide any underlying documentation. She doesn't provide any evidence, anything like that. She just throws out text Lyndon Johnson and, different things like that. No evidence. All right, so let's continue here. Black two-parent homes continue to plummet over the next 20 years, hitting 38% in 1990. Okay, so African-American two-parent homes, 38% in 1990. 1960 is like 80%, okay, headed by two parents. All right. Now, Andrew Billingsley, a sociologist acclaimed for his pioneering work tracing the African-American family, attributes the abrupt change in family structure not to welfare policies, but to rising unemployment. Not to welfare policies, but to rising unemployment. This is what he told TheRoot.com. Quote, what happened in the mid-1950s were technological changes that abolished unskilled jobs that most black men could do and created high-tech jobs they could not do. Okay. So, and even at this time in the 1950s, even though some of us are able to get into labor unions, there's still a lot of discrimination in the labor unions where a lot of us can't get into those. And it's also important to note that labor unions, these large labor unions that you're going to see, are largely going to start after chattel slavery ends, with the 13th Amendment being ratified and adopted December 18th, 1865. The 13th Amendment is adopted. 1866, you have the National Labor Union created. And then you're going to have these large labor unions created, and they were created largely to protect jobs for white men and to lock African-American men out of these jobs we have been doing for free for 246 years. Okay, because there were at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that African people had in this country from 1619 to 1865. As long as we were generally speaking, largely speaking, doing those jobs for free, it wasn't a problem. But now that we can compete for wages, and then in 1866, you have the Republicans in Congress who passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And the Civil Rights Act of 1866 allows African Americans to enter into labor contracts, things of this nature, so we can get better wages, compete for wages, etc. Now you want to lock us out of those jobs that we have been doing for free. Okay, so there is in my classes that I teach, especially the one dealing with the transatlantic slave trade, ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. I show this slide here. Let me bring this up. I show this slide here, and let's go to this. Let's go to the PowerPoint presentation. Here's a resource that you can look at. There were at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that African people had in this country from 1619 to 1865. This comes from the book by James Newton and Ronald Lewis in 1978 called Crafts, Artisans, Skills. Called The Other Slaves, Mechanics, Artisans, and Craftsmen. Okay. And when you look at it, they go through and they list it in alphabetical order. All right. Now, we were anchor makers, artists, bakers, barrel makers, bartenders, basket makers, beer makers, blacksmiths, cigar makers, cooks, coppersmiths, blacksmiths, hunters, hemp baggers, gardeners, engineers, etc. Okay, you get the idea. You can go research this, and there are other lists like this as well. So when you have these large labor unions being created in the American Federation of Labor, 1875, things like this, right? They're locking us out of these jobs that we have been doing for free for basically 246 years, or largely for free for 246 years. Okay, let's go back to this article here from TheRoot.com. All right, now, so yeah, the mid-1950s and technological changes, all right? So sociologist Andrew Billingsley told The Root, explaining that the advent of efficient goods producing machines drove millions of black men out of the stable blue collar workforce. Quote, that's what kept black families from getting and staying married, not the welfare system. To say otherwise is a misunderstanding of the data and a misreading of history. Now, You've heard me say a number of times, if you watch me here on the African History Network show, or you see me on Roland Martin Unfiltered, because I'm on Roland Martin Unfiltered every Friday. Been on every Friday since October 2020. I'm not just a historian, I'm also a national political commentator. Your understanding of politics is directly related to your understanding of history. Your understanding of politics is directly related to your understanding of history. I can tell Candace Owens does not understand history. I've said this before. I've also said Charlemagne the God does not understand politics or history either. He does not. Okay, I said this back in 2020. Okay, as well as Charlemagne the God. He does not understand history. He does not understand politics. I said this back in 2016 as well. And everything I said is true. It's proven to be true. Okay, let's continue. Now, Andrew Billingsley, sociologist Andrew Billingsley, I'll come to his next statement here. But on the subject of common misconceptions about public assistance, HUD, Housing and Urban Development, Department of Housing and Urban Development, would like to clarify that there is no public housing eligibility requirement that excludes couples. Some states used to apply such regulations, but check this out. This is what the Black conservatives, most of them, are not going to tell you, especially Candace Owens. But the Supreme Court struck those down in 1968. Have any of these Black conservatives told you this? The Supreme Court struck this down in 1968. Quote, the notion that we have rules prohibiting fathers from living in the home is simply not true, end quote, said Sims, who added that the agency does take income levels into consideration, quote, but if two parents are working and don't qualify, we have a significant supply of other affordable housing programs around the country for them. Now, this article is from 2011, okay? I want to focus on Supreme Court 1968, because there was a Supreme Court case in 1968 of King versus Smith. King versus Smith. Let's take a look at that. Okay. Well, so, you know, some people may ask the question, well, Michael Imhotep, I never heard of the Supreme Court case of King versus Smith. Well, I'm glad you asked that question. That's a very good question. Let's take a look at this. So I want to look at this entry from encyclopedia.com dealing with man in the house rule. Man in the house rule. And this comes from West Encyclopedia of American Law. West, W-E-S-T apostrophe S, West Encyclopedia of American Law. Okay, man in the house rule. Okay, and encyclopedia.com has gives you access to all these online encyclopedias so you can do research. Okay, man in the house rule, a regulation that was formally applied in certain jurisdictions that denied poor families welfare payments in the event that a man resided under the same roof with them. Okay, but that was state law. Okay, that wasn't something that President Johnson instituted. That was applied at some state levels. Under the man in the house rule, a child who otherwise qualified for welfare benefits was denied those benefits if the child's mother was living with or having relations with any single or married able-bodied male. The man was considered a substitute father, even if the man was not supporting the child. Before 1968, administrative agencies in many states created and enforced the man in the house rule. Okay, in many states, not federal law, but at the state level. In 1968, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the regulation as being contrary to the legislative goals of the Aid to Families of Dependent Children, known as AFDC. The AFDC program established by what? The Social Security Act of 1935. Now, why didn't Candace Owens tell you that it was President Roosevelt who created the Social Security, who created welfare, because AFDC was part of the Social Security Act. We're going to look at the Social Security Act in 1935 in just a minute. Okay, I'm a historian. All right, so I ain't one of these sensationalist people. You know, everybody has do a podcast. I started doing podcasts in 2010 before people even knew what the hell it was. Okay, I was doing blog talk radio before people knew what blog talk radio was. I've done nationally syndicated radio. I've done traditional terrestrial radio with an FCC license for 7 years here in Detroit, 910 AM WFDF. Then on WCHB 1200 AM with my frat brother Angelo Henderson. I did a recurring segment on his show for a year. So I've been in radio 14 years. Okay, I still do podcasts, but I was doing that before anybody knew what it was. So, and I'm a historian, so the type of information you're going to get from me is a whole lot different than what you're going to get from a lot of these sources out here. So the AFDC program established by the Social Security Act of 1935, Candace Owens didn't tell you that, provides benefits to the children of impoverished parents. In the U.S. Supreme Court case of King versus Smith, 1968, King versus Smith, 1968, the U.S. Supreme Court entertained a challenge to the man in the house rule brought by the 4 children of Miss Sylvester Smith, who was a widow. The children were denied benefits by Dallas County, Alabama, welfare authorities based on their knowledge that a man named Williams was visiting Miss Smith on weekends and had sexual relations with her. Okay. Now, the children of Miss Smith filed a class action suit in federal court on behalf of other children in Alabama who were denied benefits under Alabama's, quote, substitute father regulation. This regulation considered a man a substitute father if, 1, he lived in the home with the mother, 2, if he visited the mother frequently for the purpose of living with the mother, 3, if he cohabitated with the mother elsewhere. Now, King cited Alabama Manual for Administration of Public Assistance. Testimony in the case revealed that there was some confusion among the authorities over how to interpret the regulation. Okay, there was some confusion by the authorities on how to interpret the regulation. One official testified that the regulation applied only if parties had sex at least once a week. Another official testified that sex every 3 months was sufficient. Now, I don't know how they're going to determine how often the woman is having sex. I don't know if they're giving pelvic exams or what back in 1968. I don't know, but this was state law. Okay. Just crazy. All right. But only if the parties had sex at least once a week. Another official testified that sex every 3 months was sufficient. And still another official placed the frequency of sex at once every 6 months. Now, okay, I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to leave that alone. Okay. Now, according to the High Court, Congress did not intend that the AFDC program required children, quote, to look for their food to a man who is not in the least obliged to support them, end quote. The court maintained that when Congress used the term parent in the Social Security Act of 1935, it was referring to, quote, an individual who owed the child a state-imposed legal duty of support. An individual who owed the child a state-imposed legal duty of support. Ultimately, the court struck down the man in the house rule. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down the man in the house rule by holding that under the FDC provisions in the Social Security Act, quote, destitute children who are legally fatherless cannot be flatly denied federally funded assistance on the transparent fiction that they have a substitute father, end quote. So why aren't these black conservatives out here who are supposed to be black conservatives / grifters / MAGA nuts, who are supposed to be for law and order and family values? Why aren't they telling us about this U.S. Supreme Court case from 1968? Why didn't Candace Owens mention this? This is the type of BS I'm talking about, because these people know better. These people know better, but they will consistently lie. And you have people like Charlamagne the God and DJ Envy that just let her sit her ass up there and just tell these lies and not challenge her on this. You don't have any producers. I've been on radio shows. You don't have any producers that fact check live time and say, hey, wait a second, she told 22 lies. We need to clear this stuff up before we let her get off the air. What are you doing? Okay, so read that from Man in the House Rule, encyclopedia.com. Read about that 1968 U.S. Supreme Court case. Okay, now let's go back to, do I have any more in that article from the Root? Yeah, okay, and also this piece from the Root. Let's go back to this very quickly because I got a bunch of articles to get through. I wanted to look very quickly here. Social Security Act of 1935, because that's where welfare starts. And that's largely for white people, especially white women. Okay, Supreme Court strikes it down 1968. Quote, the notion that, let's see, okay, we have rules. I got that. Okay, you can read this. It talks about another idea swirling around is that people convicted of crimes aren't eligible for public housing. Under the national policy, there are only 2 crimes for which we prohibit anyone from coming in, and that's if you sold methamphetamine or if you are a lifetime registered sex offender. Sims explained. Yet local authorities can set other standards, and some do bar applicants with records. Quote, our goal is family reunification. We've let local housing authorities know that we want that changed, end quote. Okay, so read the rest of this article here. It has a lot of good information here. This is why it's important to understand history. Your level of understanding of politics is directly related to your level of understanding of history, because the two are related. Okay, now we got that, and then there was, okay, so Andrew Billingsley in the piece from theroot.com talked about technological changes when it comes to jobs that abolish unskilled jobs that most black men do and created high-tech jobs that they could not do. All right, there's a history behind that. And if we look at this article here from InTheseTimes.com, we saw that happen here in the city of Detroit. And this surrounded the auto industry. This surrounded the auto industry. And let me find this article. Let me pull this up here. So this is a piece from 2013. And they cite Thomas Segru, professor, I think he's a political science professor, Thomas Segru, in his book, The Origins of the Urban Crisis, which I read a lot of his book when we had the fake bankruptcy here in Detroit. He was cited all over the place when articles were written about this fake bankruptcy that the state of Michigan forced Detroit into. A half century after Detroit uprising, cities still stranded by capitalism and federal government. A half century after Detroit uprising, cities still stranded by capitalism and federal government. How federal policy and big auto drove black blight and white flight. Now, the original name of this article was Beyond the Myth of Black Misleadership. That was the original name of this article. Why they changed the name, I don't know. but I read this article originally when it came out in 2013. So I know what the original name was. And what they were saying is that when African-American mayors like Mayor Coleman Alexander Young and black mayors across the country, when they took over these cities, it was basically after white flight set in. And when they took these cities over, these cities were on life support. And then the black mayors get blamed for basically whatever went wrong in the city, even though, you know, there may be some things that they did wrong. But it's like, wait a second. They were given a city with declining resources, the city with a declining tax base, a city where you had white flight and you had infrastructure, you had factories being moved out of the inner city out to the suburbs. Okay. And this is what happened. Now, there's a part in here where they talk about the factories that I want to look at here. And they talk about the automation in the factories. That's what I want to focus on. Okay. So, okay, they say, so the nation still calls Detroit the Motor City. By the end of the 1950s, it was certainly not that. Big Auto dealt the first blow, flush with cash from World War II, because you got to understand what's called the arsenal of democracy. Okay. And President Roosevelt, even before the U.S. gets involved in fighting in World War II, when Pearl Harbor is attacked December 7, 1941, President Roosevelt says that the U.S. can be the arsenal of democracy and make military weapons for the Allied forces. Okay, so this is what happens, and this creates a lot of jobs even for African Americans. You have Executive Order 8802 that President Roosevelt is forced by A. Philip Randolph to put in place in June of 1941, because A. Philip Randolph of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters threatens to put 100,000 African Americans marching on Washington to embarrass Roosevelt if Roosevelt doesn't desegregate these jobs in the Department of Defense so African Americans can get these jobs. This was going to be the first march on Washington. The day before the march was supposed to take place, President Roosevelt relinquishes and agrees to desegregate these jobs in the Department of Defense. So A. Philip Randolph calls off the first march on Washington. That was going to be in 1941. All right, now, flush with cash from World War II and anticipating a huge growth in demand for their products, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler abandoned Detroit's multi-story plants because the big three got lucrative contracts from the federal government to make military equipment. Abandoned in favor of new sprawling horizontal campuses on former farmland in the Detroit suburbs and in Ohio, Indiana, and Canada. Between 1947 and 1948, the big three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, as they were known back then, built 25 new factories, none of them in the city of Detroit. Okay. Taking at face value, this made sense as Detroit then lacked the land for the new horizontally integrated and automated plants. Yet, as historian Thomas Segru and others point out, it was a way for the auto companies to weaken the UAW, United Auto Workers Union, which had won unprecedented victories during the war years, World War II. And with the industry went jobs. With the auto industry went auto jobs. Not just with the big three, but also with suppliers of the big three. Okay. And African Americans were having a lot of these jobs, but when they move from inner cities, these factories out into the automated plants, automation eliminated a lot of entry level jobs that our fathers, grandfathers, and great grandfathers had. Okay. When they moved up here from Mississippi and Tennessee and Alabama and Texas and Florida and all that, moving into Detroit, moving into Cleveland, moving into Gary, Indiana. In 1960, only Chrysler produced cars in the city of Detroit. It's 60,000 Detroit workers, representing only half those employed just a decade earlier. In less than 2 decades, from 1947 to 1967, Detroit lost 128,000 jobs in the auto industry alone. Now, the jobs in the auto industry there are other industries, there are other businesses that rely on people having jobs in the auto industry so they can spend money with them. Okay. So when you talk about technology eliminating jobs, especially for African-American men, there's a history behind this. That is true. Okay, read the rest of this article. Then they go on and talk about in 1949, Congress passed the Federal Housing Act. Okay, for the first time, home ownership required only 3% down for attractive low interest rate mortgage. Okay, so and then we get into the GI Bill of 1945-1946, and even though some African Americans who served in World War II can take advantage of those GI benefits that they earned, a lot of us were discriminated against. Okay, that's a whole nother conversation. All right, now. Okay, just give me a second here. Okay, so we dealt with that one from theroot.com. We dealt with the man in the house. We dispelled that nonsensical myth. All right, now let's look at this here. I want to look at the Social Security Act of 1935 because this is where welfare started. The Social Security Act of 1935. And then we look at the Great Society programs because the way Black conservatives and even white conservatives and Black conservatives take their talking points from white conservatives. Let's be clear on that. Black conservatives take their talking points from white conservatives. And this is why 99% of these Black conservatives will not admit that racism exists. And if you do find one, so Candace Owens said racism existed in the interview. But notice they never define what racism is, because racism is not a feeling. Racism is not calling people racial epithets or anything like that. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race, which comes out of the ideology of European white supremacy. This is what racism is. Racism is a power structure. Okay, racism occurs when one race of people control the majority of the wealth, power, resources, privileges, benefits, land, access to education, access to opportunity, etc. And they use that to marginalize, subordinate, and do harm to another race of people. This is what racism is. That's the power structure. So then you have some people who say, well, racism exists, but systemic racism doesn't exist. Okay, because they want to reduce racism to an individual level. They're confusing racism with bigotry. Bigotry is calling people racial epithets and racial slurs and hating people. That's not racism. Racism is a power structure. And racism is designed to preserve genetic white survival. So you have people like Senator Tim Scott, Republican from South Carolina. And Senator Tim Scott, he attacked the Great Society programs. Senator Tim Scott was on in 2023 when he was running for president, his short-lived presidential campaign. They really didn't go anywhere. He was on The View, and he said that his personal success story proves that Democrats are lying about racism and proves systemic racism doesn't exist. The trick of Black conservatives. Now, let me say this from the start. I'm neither Democrat nor Republican, but I sure as hell ain't stupid. Okay. I'm a historian and national political commentator. I study politics. I can see whose policies overwhelmingly are more beneficial for African Americans, and I can see who keeps voting against those policies and keep blocking those policies. Like Senator Tim Scott was the one that blocked the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act in the U.S. Senate. The only Black senator is the one who blocked the bill. Okay, so if you watch me here on the African History Network show, you see me on Roland Martin Unfiltered. You see me on any other shows that I've been on, numerous shows I've been on over the past few years. You know, I deal with facts and evidence. Read this article from thehill.com. Scott's comments on Great Society sparks debate on Black Americans, September 28th, 2023. And Senator Tim Scott, he parrots, you know, what Candace Owens says. They attack Lyndon Johnson, Great Society programs, things like this. They talk about welfare. Now, they don't say like what caused the poverty. They don't ever want to have that discussion. They don't want to talk about 246 years of slavery, decades of Jim Crow segregation, being locked out of massive land giveaways like the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave away 270 million acres of land for 124 years. The U.S. government gave away land up until 1976. Up until 1976, from a policy from the second year of the Civil War. And African Americans were largely locked out of that. The Southern Homestead Act of 1866, which gave away something about 45 million acres of land. The Dawes Allotment Act of 1887, which gave away 138 million acres of land. We're largely locked out of these massive land giveaways. They don't want to have that type of conversation. Okay. All right. So read this piece here. In Johnson, what we had. So Tim Scott said, so often We think that all the issues you talk about, crime and education and healthcare, we always think that those issues go back to slavery. Here's the challenge, though. Black families survived slavery. We survived poll taxes and literacy tests. We survived discrimination being woven into the laws of our country. What was hard to survive was Johnson's Great Society, where they decided to put money, where they decided to take the black father out of the household to get a check in the mail. Now, I just disproved that. That's a damn lie. That's not what happened. And that was at the state level. That wasn't from President Johnson. Okay. So we just dealt with that. And the U.S. Supreme Court struck it down. Senator Tim Scott won't tell you. U.S. Supreme Court 1968 struck that down. And you can now measure that in unemployment and crime devastation. Now, little Timmy won't tell you that crime has dropped every year under the Biden-Harris administration. And in 2023, you had a record low unemployment rate for African Americans. It was under 6%. Okay. Since they have been tracking the unemployment rate by race since 1972. Tim Scott won't tell you that. Johnson's Great Society was a series of initiatives with goals including ending poverty, reducing crime, and eliminating inequality. It was the largest social reform plan in history, with investments into education, hospital care, and the expansion of Social Security. Social Security goes back to 1935. It also worked to enforce the 1964 Civil Rights Act, specifically removing barriers to voting. Okay. It's long been a target of voices on the right. I wonder why. Now, I find it interesting that Tim Scott is talking about crime, yet you're endorsing for president a man who's dealing with 88 criminal charges and who was found liable for rape in state court in New York. But Senator Tim Scott, you want to talk about crime. Donald Trump is the ultimate criminal. He ain't a smooth criminal like Michael Jackson said. He's the ultimate criminal. Okay, so let's look at briefly here. Social Security Act 1935. How's everybody doing? Okay, give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like on this broadcast. Follow us here on our social media platforms, the African History Network on Facebook, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP on YouTube, and visit our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. So if you'd like this type of information, you can register for the online history classes that I teach on Saturdays, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, usually Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. We deal with thousands of years of history and what leads up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. We had a great class this weekend. Our next class is Saturday, March 30th, Saturday, April 6th, April 13th, April 20th, and then we have a couple more classes after that. Okay, so we have the information here. Click here to register. The lesson plan for all 10 sessions, plus there was an introductory session. The lesson plan is all laid out here, so you can see the type of content that we cover. Click here to download the lesson plan, and you can register for the class right here. We do the sessions live. All the sessions are archived and recorded. You can go back and watch it anytime. So a year from now, 2 years from now, even after the course is over with, you still have full access. You can go back and watch it anytime. All right, I want to look at this piece from archives.gov. Now, what's archives.gov, you may ask? That's a very good question. That is the U.S. National Archives, because I'll go to all these different government websites to do research. The U.S. National Archives is archives.gov. They have a piece here dealing with the Social Security Act of 1935, which is part of the New Deal. Okay. And I just want to look at this briefly here. All right, listen to the milestone documents. So all this information, the U.S. Constitution, the Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, all that stuff. Library of Congress website, loc.gov, archives.gov, U.S. National Archives, all that information's here. All right, let's take a look at this. Social Security Act, 1935. And you scroll down, they have the text. On August 14th, 1935, the Social Security Act established a system of old age benefits for workers, benefits for victims of industrial accidents, unemployment insurance, and aid for dependent mothers and children. Aid for dependent mothers and children. This is where FDC comes from. The Social Security Act of 1935, which is largely for white people. Okay. And we were being discriminated against a lot when welfare was introduced. So a lot of us couldn't qualify for it. Persons who are blind and persons with disabilities. Okay. Before the 1930s, support for the elderly was a matter of local, state, and family concern rather than a federal concern, except for veterans' pensions. All right, so they talk about President Roosevelt, January 17th, 1935, sent a message to Congress asking for quote unquote Social Security legislation. And let's see. Okay, so you can read the rest of that. But this is where welfare starts. Okay, 1935. Now, you have so many people talk about the Great Society programs, but they really don't talk about what they were. Because when they talk about the Great Society programs and President Johnson, the conversation goes like this. Poverty, poor black people, they didn't want to work, given food stamps, given welfare, and they're made to look like they're living off the government, too lazy to get a job or something like this. These are the racial tropes that are thrown out. And sometimes they're echoed by African Americans as well. Okay, so let's look at this. What was the Great Society program, okay, of dealing with President Johnson, okay, 1964? All right, that's a good question. So I want to go to this piece here. Great Society programs definition. This is from history.com, official website of the History Channel. Let's see. Let's go to. Oh, also this article here on the Social Security Act. You can read this one as well. Let me pull this up here quickly. This is a good piece on the Social Security Act of 1935 for more information. Okay, Social Security Act signed into law by President Franklin Roosevelt in 1935 created Social Security, a federal safety net for elderly, unemployed, and disadvantaged Americans, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so they go through and give you a history on that. Early forms of Social Security, etc. Industrial Revolution. Okay, so check that out. All right, now I want to go to this piece here on Great Society programs. And I was watching, I was up late a couple of Saturdays ago, and I was watching the World Channel, channel 287 here in Detroit on Xfinity Comcast. And that is a PBS station, public broadcasting system. And they were showing Eyes on the Prize, but they were showing the second Eyes on the Prize series, which deals with history from about 1964 into the 1980s. And they dealt with Richard Nixon winning the presidency in 1968. Okay. And Nixon ran on an anti-civil rights platform. And he ran on a platform against spending billions of dollars in the inner cities. He ran on a platform against the Great Society programs, things like this. He said, we're wasting billions of dollars. These programs are not working, etc. Okay, we're going to talk about that in just a minute, because this is something a lot of these, I listen to some of these black conservatives. I can't tolerate a whole lot from them, but I listen to some of them and they don't want to talk about this. I can't figure out why. Great Society. The Great Society was an ambitious series of policy initiatives, legislation, and programs spearheaded by President Lyndon Johnson with the main goals of ending poverty, okay, ending poverty, reducing crime, abolishing inequality, and improving the environment. All right, so notice now you have Republicans who are attacking diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, which are designed to create more opportunity. They just struck down the 6-3 conservative Supreme Court, Donald Trump Supreme Court, because those are lifetime appointments, just struck down affirmative action when it comes to college admissions. And now they're going after, you have conservative activists like Ed Bloom. Now they're trying to go after DEI programs. You just had Alabama, Governor Kay Ivey in Alabama signed a bill into law which makes DEI programs in state-funded DEI programs in the colleges, things like this, made that illegal in the state of Alabama. Good old Alabama, former Confederate state, which was ground zero. Remember, Selma, Alabama was ground zero for the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Okay, so President Lyndon Johnson with the main goals of ending poverty, reducing crime, abolishing inequality, and improving the environment. In May of 1964, President Lyndon Baines Johnson laid out his agenda for a great society, quote unquote, great society, during a speech at the University of Michigan, right here in the state of Michigan, where I live. With his eye on re-election that year, Johnson set in motion his Great Society, the largest social reform plan in modern history, the largest social reform plan in modern history, riding a wave of empathy. On November 22nd, 1963, we know that President Kennedy's assassinated, so Lyndon Johnson is sworn in as he was vice president, sworn in as president. The assassination of Kennedy left American citizens reeling. Okay, left American citizens reeling. They felt empathy, even sympathy for Johnson as he became president under such difficult circumstances. Johnson took advantage of this support to push through key elements of Kennedy's legislative agenda, in particular, civil rights legislation and tax cuts. Now, keep in mind, there was a filibuster in the U.S. Senate for about 2 months blocking the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay, so he had to use a lot of political capital to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. Okay, the way they summarize it here makes it sound a lot easier than it was. And then when when Dr. King and the other civil rights leaders came wanting the Voting Rights Act of 1965, President Johnson told them that he expended a lot of political capital the year before to get the Civil Rights Act passed, and he said he wouldn't be able to get a Voting Rights Act passed. So they go out, they have the protest, they have the Bloody Sunday March after Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed by Alabama state troopers. Okay, earlier, it was in February, I think it was February 1965. And originally the Bloody Sunday March, they were going to take the coffin of Jimmy Lee Jackson and drop it at the state Capitol House, okay, in Alabama. The Selma to Montgomery March, because Montgomery is the capital of Alabama. That's what the original march was going to be. Okay, after Jimmy Lee Jackson was assassinated, and he was part of the inspiration for that Selma to Montgomery March. Now, by the time he became president, Johnson was a Green politician, wasn't a Green politician, nor a pushover. After several stints in the U.S. House of Representatives and U.S. Senate, where he was the youngest Senate minority leader and then Senate majority leader, he earned a reputation as a powerful leader who knew how to get things done. Okay, so they talk about the war on poverty. In March 1964, Johnson introduced the Office of Economic Opportunity and the Economic Opportunity Act. The Office of Economic Opportunity and the Economic Opportunity Act during a special message to Congress. He had hoped to help the underprivileged break the poverty cycle by helping them develop job skills, further their education, and find work. Okay, hold on, wait a second. Because when we hear these conservatives, Republicans, MAGA, nuts, etc., when we hear them talk about the Great Society programs, they sum up Great Society programs as welfare, lazy black people, don't want to work, etc. They don't talk about job training and job programs and education programs. That's all part of the Great Society. So you have to ask yourself this question. Well, why are they giving this skewed revisionist history of what the Great Society programs were? I don't know. Maybe you can figure it out. I don't know. President Johnson had hoped to help the underprivileged break the poverty cycle by helping them develop job skills, further their education, and find work. To do this, he created Job Corps for 100,000 disadvantaged men. Half would work on conservation projects, and the other half would receive education and skills training in special job training centers. In addition, President Johnson tasked state and local governments with creating work training programs for up to 200,000 men and women. Okay? Don't sound like lazy people that don't want to work. A national work study program was also established to offer 140,000 Americans the chance to go to college who could otherwise not afford it. So if you've been to college and there was a work study program in college where you worked, I think it's 20 hours or less, or you work 20 hours and you get paid from the college and there's federal funding around that, things like this. This is where the work study program comes from, the Great Society programs. Okay, so people could go to college and earn some money at the same time. A national work study program was also established to offer 140,000 Americans the chance to go to college who could otherwise not afford it. Other initiatives the so-called War on Poverty offered were a community action program for people to tackle poverty within their own communities, the ability for the government to recruit and train skilled American volunteers to serve poverty-stricken communities, loans and guarantees for employers who offered jobs to the unemployed, funds for farmers to purchase land and establish agricultural co-ops, help for unemployed parents preparing to enter the workforce. President Johnson knew battling poverty would not be easy.
Lyndon Johnson had many motivations.
President Johnson knew that battling poverty would not be easy. Still, he said, quote, "This program will show the way to new opportunities for millions of our fellow citizens. It will provide a lever with which we can begin to open the door to our prosperity for those who have been kept outside," end quote. Now, many Great Society programs fell under the War on Poverty umbrella. Okay, then you had Medicare and Medicaid that are saving a lot of white people's lives. Medicare and Medicaid. Okay, that was President Johnson also. By the time President Johnson took office, mainly two groups of Americans were uninsured, the elderly and the poor. Despite President Kennedy championing health care for the needy during his 1960 presidential campaign and beyond. Now, he ran against Nixon in 1960. Nixon comes back. Nixon lost in 60, comes back and wins in 68 on an anti-black agenda, anti-affirmative action, a law and order agenda, basically anti-affirmative action. It was a white backlash to what was taking place at that time, a white backlash to the rebellions taking place across the country, different things like this. And he ran largely on an anti-Great Society platform also, President Johnson. Okay. Despite Kennedy championing healthcare for the needy during his 1960 presidential campaign and beyond, and public support for the cause, many Republicans and some Southern Democrats in Congress shot down early Medicare and Medicaid legislation. So read the rest of that. Then you have Head Start education and reform to empower parents and make sure every child had a shot of success in life, no matter their social or economic circumstances. President Johnson, politician and activist Sargent Shriver, and a team of child development experts launched Project Head Start. Okay, so Head Start, that's President Lyndon Baines Johnson also, the Great Society programs. The Head Start program started as an eight-week summer camp run by the Office of Economic Opportunity for 500,000 children ages 3 to 5. Since the program's inception, it has served over 32 million vulnerable children in America. Okay, so read the rest of this as well. Okay, And then they talk about urban renewal also. All right, so this is Great Society. Name of this article, Great Society. This is at history.com. Now, I wonder why these black, especially these black conservatives out here, when they talk about the Great Society programs, they don't explain it like this and lay out the facts and lay out what the programs were and things like this and how they were helping people. So you're going to have President Nixon, like I said, who's going to come in. And even though, you know, he talked about cutting red tape and he still wanted to help the poor and needy, etc. Nixon wasn't completely successful, however, and the political infighting for social reform has been raging ever since. But he ran on the platform of largely reducing the amount of money that's spent on those social programs. And then we know that President Reagan is going to run on a similar platform. Okay, now, speaking of Ronald Reagan, you know, you have people who talk about the divorce rate and lack of fathers in the home and people not getting married, people getting divorced, things like this, right? Okay, now we already dispelled the myth dealing with welfare, took the black father out of the home. We talked about the U.S. Supreme Court case of King versus Smith, 1968, where U.S. Supreme Court struck that down. We already talked about that. Do you know when the U.S. divorce rate started really climbing? It was in the 1970s, the early 1970s. And then you started seeing this reflected in TV shows like Maude, TV shows like One Day at a Time. I think it was One Day at a Time. Movies like Kramer versus Kramer, you know, Dustin Hoffman, like 78, 79. Check out this article from CNN.com. Now, I've talked about this before here on the African History Network show, because I've been doing the show 14 years. What is no-fault divorce, and why do some conservatives want to get rid of it? Now, this is from November 27th, 2023. Do you know when the no-fault divorce law went into effect? That was in 1969. Where did it start? In California. Who signed it into law? The governor of California. Who was the governor of California in 1969? Ronald Reagan. Aren't Republicans supposed to be the party of family values? Let's look at this. So what is the history of no-fault divorce in the U.S.? No-fault divorce was first legalized in California in 1969 by then Governor Ronald Reagan, who used to do movies with a chimpanzee. Okay, that's a whole nother conversation. Who would eventually become the first U.S. president who had been divorced. Okay, former President Donald Trump was the second president to be divorced. The first president, the party of family values, the first president to be divorced was Ronald Reagan. The second president to be divorced was Donald Trump. Both Donald Trump is not a conservative. He classifies himself as a Republican. He's more like a rhino, Republican in name only. He's MAGA, and he's the leader of a death cult. That's what MAGA is, a death cult. By 2010, every state had legalized no-fault divorce, a no-fault divorce option. Before this option, an at-fault divorce was the only recourse for a broken union. This led to complications for couples whose situation, for one reason or another, did not fit the required legal procedure. Couples, now the name of this law, this was the Family Law Act of 1969. That's the law, the Family Law Act of 1969. Couples who wanted a divorce were all but forced by the law to create some sort of fault-based scenario. It was uncommon for couples to concoct scenarios together that would feign adultery, or it was uncommon for couples to concoct scenarios together that would feign adultery, or for one party to move across state lines to fulfill legal requirements for fault claims like abandonment. Migratory divorce, where a couple would move together to a state with no fault divorce laws, was common. Okay, so they also go on to talk about how this also helped women who were like in abusive relationships and things of this nature. Okay. All right. So you can read the rest. You can read the rest of this. But this is when you're going to start seeing a rise in the divorce rate because of the Family Law Act of 1969, signed into law by then Governor Ronald Reagan. Okay, and unfortunately, I can't figure out why a lot of these conservatives don't want to talk about that, especially these black conservatives running around. And the black conservatives will only say basically what the white conservatives allowed them to say. This is why you really can't find any of them who admit systemic racism exists. And I said this before on Roland Martin Unfiltered. The reason why they want to admit systemic racism exists is because they have absolutely no policies to deal with it. So they want to pretend like it doesn't exist. So Senator Tim Scott, when he was on The View, he said Democrats were lying about systemic racism. And he said that his personal success story of going from cotton to Congress in one generation proves that systemic racism doesn't exist. That's BS. That's a lie. Okay. Your individual success story does not prove that systemic racism doesn't exist. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race that comes out of an ideology of European white supremacy. And what these conservatives always want to do is they always want to reduce it down to the individual. Okay. And whenever you find examples that contradict what they say, they try to make that they may agree with you, but then they want to say it's an isolated incident. Okay. They don't want to deal with the broad spectrum of things. All right, now let's continue here because I got a few more articles. Okay. We dealt with InTheseTimes.com. All right, now, you know when the WIC program started? Because I heard Candace Owens say 1950s welfare. Then she said 1960s with President Johnson. You ever study the history of WIC, Women and Independent Children? The WIC program, SNAP program. Let's look at this here quickly. This comes from snaptohealth.org, snaptohealth.org. And there are other sources I looked at on this, but this deals with the history of the WIC program. And it starts here in 1968, history of WIC. During the 1960s, various studies identified hunger as a major problem in this country. Physicians describe young women, often pregnant, in their clinics with various ailments caused by lack of food. In Atlanta, Georgia, doctors and clinic staff began to prescribe needed foods, and the prescription served as a voucher. Women would use to obtain food package. Separately, in Baltimore, Maryland, Dr. David Page of Johns Hopkins University was developing Johns Hopkins University, JOHNS, Johns Hopkins University, was developing a similar food distribution program using vouchers. Now we know the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, later the Black Panther Party, we know they had a food program also. Then in 1969, December 1969, the White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, and Health focused on the problem of malnutrition and hunger due to poverty. Conference recommendations called for special attention to be given to the nutritional needs of low-income pregnant women. Who was the president in 1969? Was it Lyndon Johnson? No, it was Richard Nixon. This picture right here, President Nixon during the White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, and Health, 1969. 1972. On September 26, 1972, an amendment to the Child Nutrition Act of 1966 authorized WIC. So an amendment to the 1966 Child Nutrition Act authorized WIC in 1972, which means WIC started under Richard Nixon, the Republican. But the black conservatives don't want to tell you this. Especially Candace Owens. The legislation established the Special Supplemental Food Program as a 2-year pilot program using Dr. David Page's voucher program as a model. 1973, Richard Nixon is president. The program is renamed Special Supplemental Food Program for Women, Infants, and Children, WIC. 2 food packages are developed, 1 for infants and 1 for children and pregnant or breastfeeding women. Okay, read the rest of this here. I just find it very interesting that they don't talk about this under a Republican president. I can't figure out why they don't want to say this. I can't figure that out. Now, when Candace Owens talked about lack of fathers in the home, lack of black fathers in the home, things of this nature. I was on the Tammy Mack, the radio show host Tammy Mack. She had a streaming show on the Fox Soul TV network. So I did her show 3 times. I was on one time with Dr. Umar Johnson, and we were on with that crazy fool, Reverend Jesse Lee Peterson. It was actually supposed to be Nephew Tommy from the Steve Harvey Morning Show. There was a last minute scheduling conflict with Nephew Tommy. He couldn't do the show. Somehow, I guess Jesse Lee Peterson was the only person available, but Jesse Lee Peterson is crazy. Okay. It was a interesting conversation. When people talk about the war on drugs, right? Do you know when the war on drugs started? The war on drugs was declared June 17th, 1971. Do you know who declared the war on drugs? It was Richard Nixon to Congress. And Nixon ran, like I said, he ran on a platform, an anti-black platform of law and order. So I find it interesting when people don't want to, especially these conservatives out here, don't want to deal with this history. Now, back in 2016, I did a 2-hour lecture dealing with the history of Richard Nixon's war on drugs. Did you know that the U.S. prison population quadrupled from about 1970 to 1993? You know, I know people, somehow this myth started that the war on drugs began with the 1994 crime bill. And there were 18 parts to the crime bill. Some were good, some were bad, some went too far. That's true. The Violence Against Women Act was good. The assault rifle ban was good. 3 strikes and you're out, which, if I remember correctly, originated out of California. That was not something that was positive. But that's not where the war on drugs began. That's not where the increase in the prison rate started. That begins with Richard Nixon in 1971. June 17, 1971, Richard Nixon declared his war on drugs. Do you know who John Ehrlichman was? John Ehrlichman was Richard Nixon's domestic policy advisor. Did you read the April 2016 front page story from Harper's Weekly called "Legalize It All: How to Win the War"? It dealt with an interview that the author of the article did with Dan Baum, journalist Dan Baum, B-A-U-M, did with John Ehrlichman after John Ehrlichman got out of prison, out of federal prison, because he went to federal prison for 18 months behind the Watergate scandal. In Legalize It All, the April 2016 cover story of Harper's Magazine, journalist Dan Baum, author of Smoke and Mirrors, The War on Drugs and the Politics of Failure, discusses his 1994 interview with John Ehrlichman. John Ehrlichman died in 1999. He was President Richard Nixon's chief domestic policy advisor and had spent 18 months behind bars for conspiracy to obstruct justice and perjury as a result of the Watergate cover-up. There's a good article at AtlantaBlackStar.com, and all the news outlets had articles out about this article from Harper's magazine. But this piece is called "Nixon Advisors Said the War on Drugs Was a Manufactured Lie Designed to Target and Disrupt the Black Community," end quote. Okay, this is from AtlantaBlackStar.com, March 23rd, 2016. In Legalize It All, John Ehrlichman, the Watergate co-conspirator, unlocked for me this is what Dan Baum said, the writer of the article, unlocked for me one of the great mysteries of modern American history. How did the United States entangle itself in a policy of drug prohibition that has yielded so much misery and so few good results? Americans have been criminalizing psychoactive substances since San Francisco's anti-opium law of 1875. Now, the anti-opium law of 1875 was directed toward Chinese men working on the railroads, and white men feared that Chinese men high on opium would seduce white women. Okay, so this is why you had this was basically the first anti-drug law in the country, the anti-opium law of 1875 in San Francisco. But it was John Ehrlichman's boss, Richard Nixon, who declared the first war on drugs and set the country on the widely punitive and counterproductive path it still pursues. Now, the war on drugs was winding down under the two terms of President Barack Obama. You had a declining number of people in prison under President Obama. The war on drugs, it's going to ramp up some under Trump, and then you have it really winding down under Biden, Harris, and we know the statistics just came out under Biden, Harris. Each year under the Biden-Harris administration, we see violent crime rates nationwide have gone down. Now, crime rates in your specific city may be up, but nationwide, violent crime rates are down each year under the Biden-Harris administration. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but it's going in the right direction. Now, I had tracked John Ehrlichman, who had been Nixon's domestic policy advisor, to an engineering firm in Atlanta where he was working on minority recruitment. I barely recognized him. He was much heavier than he'd been at the time of the Watergate scandal 2 decades earlier, etc. John Ehrlichman said this. He said, Dan Baum said that John Ehrlichman told the truth when he asked him, you really want to know about what the war on drugs was about? He said, quote, "We knew we could not make it illegal to be either against the war, the Vietnam War, or to be black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and to associate blacks with heroin, the harder drug, heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did, end quote. Now, this excerpt is it's in the article from Harper's Magazine 2016, April 2016. This specific excerpt is from theroot.com, March 22nd, 2016. Former Nixon aide claims war on drugs invented to suppress black people. All right, so check that out. Okay, now, and I'm going to look at my notes here because I have all these notes laid out of what to cover. Give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like on this broadcast. Be sure to follow us. Sign up for, register for the online history class I teach on Saturdays. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school, where we get deep into history. We deal with thousands of years of history and what leads up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. So next classes are Saturday, March 30th, April 16th, April 13th, April 20th, and then after that be April 27th. Okay, we do them 2 p.m. Up until about 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Click here to register here. It's on sale $80, regularly $130. And we have the full course outline, the lesson plans for each class session. We have it laid out here. We're going to do probably 12 sessions instead of 10. Okay, and you can download the whole course outline right here. All right, let's continue. There was an article from the New York Times. Some of you all may have seen this article, April 20th, 2015, called 1.5 million men, 1.5 million missing black men. How many people saw this article from the New York Times? So I read the New York Times, Washington Post every day. Read articles from them. I have thousands of articles bookmarked in my archives, thousands printed up, etc., all over the office here. If we look at this quickly from the New York Times, now the war on drugs dates back to Richard Nixon. And I still don't know why these black conservatives out here are not saying that. I don't. Maybe it's a conservative code. Maybe they can't tell the truth about other Republicans or something like that. Ronald Reagan said, never speak negatively. I'm paraphrasing, never speak negatively about another Republican. Maybe they're operating based upon that code or something like that. Just let me pull this up. Richard Nixon. Okay. There was a good article from NPR.org or .com dealing with the war on drugs, also Richard Nixon's war on drugs. I'll find it. 1.5 million missing black men, April 20th, 2015. For every 100 black women not in jail, there are only 83 black men. Now the numbers may have changed a little bit since 2015. Okay, I haven't looked at the latest numbers from 2023. The remain or 20, whatever the latest numbers are, 2022, 2023. I haven't looked at them. The remaining men, 1.5 million of them are in a sense missing. So you can go through and look at this, but it talks about how in New York, almost 120,000 black men between the ages of 25 and 54 are missing from everyday life. In Chicago, 45,000 are, more than 30,000 missing in Philadelphia, etc. Okay. Now, they are missing largely because of early deaths or because they are behind bars. They are missing largely because of early deaths or because they are behind bars. Remarkably, black women who are 25 to 54 and not in jail outnumber black men in that category by 1.5 million, according to an Upshot analysis. So Upshot is New York Times, okay? New York Times analysis, researchers. For every 100 black women in this age group living outside of jail, there are only 83 black men. Among whites, the equivalent number is 99, nearly parity. African-American men have long been more likely to be locked up and more likely to die young, but the scale of the combined toll is nonetheless jarring. It is a measure of the deep disparities that continue to afflict Black men, disparities being debated after a recent spate of killings by police, and the gender gap is itself a further cause of social ills, leaving many communities without enough men to be fathers and husbands. Okay, so read the rest of this here. I don't have time to go through the whole thing. But when I hear people talk about the war on drugs, somehow they don't talk about Richard Nixon. I can't figure that one out. This piece here, this is from the one I want is from National Public Radio, NPR. Can I find that one on Nixon? Hold on, I think I have it in my presentation. The one let's see if I have it here, because I'm pretty sure I cited that article. I did this presentation in 2016, so it's been a while since I've looked at it. What is that? Let me see. Okay. No, I can't find it. There was one from there's one from National Public Radio that deals with the changing mood in America in the early 1970s. And it was a mood that switched from drug rehabilitation to punishment, from drug rehabilitation to punishment. Okay, I can't find it. I have to deal with this in part 2 of this discussion. All right, now. Okay, so we dealt with that. We dealt with Richard Nixon's war on drugs. I'm checking my notes here. Just give me a second here. I want to make sure I cover all this. Oh, so I mentioned the party realignment earlier in our discussion, right? And this is something else. When I was on the Tammy Mack Late Show with these two black, because there's one MAGA nut in this black conservative. The black conservative was older. He may have been probably in his 50s. He was a little more sensible than the MAGA nut. But they didn't want to have a conversation about the party realignment. And Candace Owens doesn't want to have this conversation either. And she also has said previously that the Southern strategy did not exist. The Southern strategy is a myth. That's a damn lie. Okay, that's a damn lie. And I've been doing pretty good on this show. If you not cussing, because my mother's probably watching. If you saw my Facebook post that I did about an hour before the show, I said I'm getting all my cussing out right before I go live, because my mother will probably be watching the show and she doesn't like me cussing. All right, so I got it pretty much out of my system before I started the show. So some people may ask the question, if you understand history at all, okay, you may ask the question, well, how did the party of Lincoln win over the Democratic South? Because Republicans are heavy in the South, these red states, these former Confederate states. So you may ask the question, well, how did they win over the South? Well, that's a very good question. Okay. First of all, let's look at this piece here from ChicagoMag.com, because a few years ago, I did a 3-hour lecture dealing with the history of why African Americans switched from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. And you have people who say, oh, well, it was because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's wrong. because by 1960, 2/3 of African Americans had already switched over to the Democratic Party. It wasn't because of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. You have to go decades before that. Okay. And as one of my teachers, Professor Kabahaya Watha-Kamene says, and if you've seen the African History Network show over the 14 years we've been on the air, you know I've interviewed him numerous times. He says, to understand the existence of something, you must first understand the pre-existence of existence. Okay. To understand the existence of something, you must first understand the pre-existence of existence. So this is an article when I was doing my research for my 3-hour presentation dealing with the history of why African Americans switched from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. This is one of the articles that I cited. How the party of Lincoln lost virtually the entire black vote in 88 years. Okay. Now this is from ChicagoMag.com. And it's this is from July 29th, 2016 by Whet Moser, W-H-E-T. It says in 1928, the Chicago Defender, African-American owned newspaper, warned the GOP that it was in danger of alienating African Americans. They did not listen. The fall came fast. They did not listen. The fall came fast. Okay. So long story short, the Republican Party is founded in 1854 as a backlash to what's known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which would have allowed the westward expansion of slavery into the Kansas and Nebraska territories. So you have a Republican Party to be the counter of the Democratic Party at the time. The Democratic Party at the time was largely the party of slave owners, but some slave owners may not have belonged to a political party. And contrary to popular belief, I know there's this myth out there that Democrats created slavery. The Democratic Party wasn't founded until 1828. They were known as Jacksonian Democrats, named after President Andrew Jackson. So the majority of the time that you have slavery in this country, if you want to trace it back to 1619 in Hampton, Virginia, when the White Lion slave ship, the White Lion pirate ship comes in and 29 Africans are traded on August 20, 1619. It was Hampton, not Jamestown, but Hampton, Virginia for food and water. If you want to start it in 1641 with Massachusetts, when they have the first codified slave laws in any of the 13 colonies, or if you want to start it in, 1681 or what have you, right? But the majority of the time that you have slavery in this country, you don't have a Democratic or Republican Party. So you're going to have the U.S. Civil War and December 20th, 1860. South Carolina is the first state to secede from the Union after Abraham Lincoln becomes president-elect in the November 6, 1860 presidential elections. He is the president-elect of the newly formed Republican Party that's only about 6 years old at the time. The South thinks that Lincoln is going to free the slaves. South Carolina is the first state to secede from the Union, December 20th, 1860. March 4th, 1861, when Abraham Lincoln gives his inaugural address, he says he has no intentions of abolishing slavery in states where slavery already exists. You're going to have more states to secede from the Union than April 12th, 1861. You have the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, which was a military stronghold in South Carolina. This starts the U.S. Civil War. So there's going to be ultimately 11 states that make up the Confederate States of America, the CSA, the Confederacy, right? So then you're going to have, after the Civil War ends in April 9th, 1865, for all practical purposes, General Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Then you're going to have the Reconstruction era, 1865, 1877. Reconstruction is going to collapse basically with the Compromise of 1877. And there's a declining effort and a declining commitment from Republicans to interfere into Southern racial conflicts on behalf of African Americans. So when the Clinton, Mississippi race riot of 1875 takes place, President Ulysses S. Grant implements his non-intervention policy when it comes to racial conflicts in the South. But in October of 1871, he declared martial law in 9 counties in South Carolina using the newly the newly passed law by Congress, which was the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which is what is known as the third of the four enforcement acts. Okay, that's just a abbreviated history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and the Reconstruction era and the collapse of Reconstruction. Okay, so now let's fast forward to 1928. 1928. Okay, and let's look at this here. Okay, we'll pick up. All right. In party ideologies in America, 1828 to 1996, political scientist John Gehring, G-E-R-R-I-N-G, or Gehring, I think it's Gehring, marks the beginning of the modern Republican Party as Herbert Hoover's shifting campaign rhetoric in 1928 and 1932. 1928 and 1932. When he talked more about the virtues of the American home and family than hard tack economics. Now, we know the stock market crash of October 1929 sends the U.S. into the Great Depression, right? And Herbert Hoover is going to be a one-term president, which hopefully Donald Trump would be. Donald Trump is Herbert Hoover Jr. because Donald Trump is the first U.S. president to leave the White House with a negative job growth. He lost 2 million jobs. Okay, he's the first president since Herbert Hoover to do that. Okay, he's Herbert Hoover Jr. Now, Herbert Hoover's oratory about the progress of the individual being threatened by overzealous government bureaucracy stuck around for the next 8 decades, and the wisdom of generations has helped us discern that this was indeed the start of a new Republican era. But missing something significant, something I learned when I interviewed Ethan McCallie about his epic history, The Defender, dealing with the Chicago Defender, how the legendary black newspaper changed America. In his book, McCallie weaves the Chicago Defender's work in and out of the country's evolution in the 20th century, from boxing rings to Chicago wards to the highest echelons of White House politics. And this is how chapter 10 begins. In the final weeks of 1928, I want to zoom in on this. I want to make sure everybody sees this, because when I'm in these panel discussions with these black conservatives, nobody wants to have this conversation. And Candace Owens is not going to talk about this either. In the final weeks of the 1928 general election, the Chicago Defender printed a series of articles and editorials that listed post-war grievances with the Republican Party. Not the Chicago Defender, the black newspaper. Post-war grievances with the Republican Party. In Washington, D.C., when the federal government was in direct authority, Republican presidents Harding and Coolidge, as well as Republican majorities in the U.S. Congress, had not only acquiesced to the segregation of public transit, but failed to stop or even criticize parades by thousands of Ku Klux Klansmen before the White House. Okay, now these are Republicans who are not standing up and advocating for African Americans. Now, this is the Chicago Defender newspaper in 1928 calling out these Republicans. Okay. These Republicans had not only acquiesced to the segregation of public transit, like buses, things like this, streetcars, but failed to stop or even criticize parades by thousands of Ku Klux Klansmen before the White House. So the Klan gets rejuvenated in 1915 and becomes very powerful in the 1920s. The newspaper was particularly dissatisfied with the current Republican nominee for president, Herbert Hoover, who had spoken favorably of making the Republican Party lily white. And this becomes known as the Lily White movement of 1928 And this was a movement to push African Americans out of the Republican Party. They were ignoring the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, ignoring segregation, ignoring the lynchings that were taking place, ignoring the increasing calls for African Americans for something to be done about these conditions. So we started slowly going over to the Democratic Party because even though we were leery of them, we found them being more receptive to our issues. This is long before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights of 1965. This is 1928, 1932, 1936, 1940. This is long before then. To understand the existence of something, you must first understand the pre-existence of existence. So Herbert Hoover, who has spoken favorably of making the Republican Party lily white and excluded African Americans from their traditional role in that year's Republican National Convention. Most troubling of all was the candidate's Herbert Hoover's covert backing from the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Klan is, I told you, the second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan, which was started by the Reverend William Joseph Simmons in 1915, had both Democrats and Republicans. Okay, so go back and read that article from the Washington Post about the second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan. Most troubling of all was the candidate's covert backing from the Ku Klux Klan, whose members despised the Democratic nominee, New York Governor Al Smith, because he was Catholic. But Al Smith was also a moderate. So you would tend to have more moderate Democrats in the North, generally speaking, and the Southern segregationist Democrats in the South in these former Confederate states. Okay, so this was the Chicago Defender calling out the Republican Party in the final weeks of the 1928 presidential election. So the article from ChicagoMag.com goes on to say, this was just 65 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Now, we know the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves January 1st, 1863, because it stated that only the slaves in territories of rebellion would be free, but Lincoln had no authority to free them because those territories had seceded from the Union. In the border states, Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware, they were allowed to keep their slaves. So Maryland doesn't abolish slavery till November 1st, 1864. Kentucky and Delaware don't abolish slavery till December 18th, 1865, when the 13th Amendment is adopted. Okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. That was a military strategy to bring the South back into the Union. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was September 22nd, 1862, and it was an ultimatum to the South trying to rob those southern states of their most valuable possession, which were their enslaved African people. It did, however, it is going to lead to, one, a change in the course of the Civil War. Two, is going to lead to slavery ending. But keep in mind, the Civil War was not fought to end slavery. The Civil War on behalf of the Union was fought to bring the South back into the Union, which was the economic engine of America. Okay, now, many people who had been emancipated from slavery by the actions of a Republican president were still alive in 1928. It's 65 years after, Emancipation Proclamation. 63 years after the ending of chattel slavery in 1865, with many more living under the rule of Democratic Jim Crow Southern politicians. So what the Chicago Defender did next was quite bold. Finally, in October 20th, 1920 editorial entitled "What We Want," the Chicago Defender made a dramatic announcement. Quote, "We want justice in America, and we mean to get it. If 50 years of support to the Republican Party does not get us justice, then we must of necessity shift our allegiance to new quarters. We must of necessity shift our allegiance to new quarters," end quote. It was the first time the Chicago Defender had failed to endorse the Republican presidential candidate since 1912. Okay, so read the rest of this. But it talks about the Lily White movement of 1928. Okay, And this is where you're going to see a really seismic shift in the Republican Party. And even though the majority of African Americans voted for Herbert Hoover in 1928, you're going to have some that vote for Al Smith. Increasingly, we're going to start going over to the Democratic Party because we're being pushed out of the Republican Party. And we see the Democratic Party as being more receptive. Okay, now let's look at this second piece here. The second article is from history.com. And this deals with how the party of Lincoln won over the Democratic South. And let me pull this up just a second here. Won over the Democratic South. Okay, so this is from last updated August 10th, 2019. Let's look at this one briefly, because this is a deep history, okay? And like I said before, your understanding of politics is directly related to your understanding of history. And I'm listening to a lot of these talking heads. I'm listening to these black conservatives. I can't tolerate a lot of Candace Owens. I listen to clips of her. I could tell she does not understand history. And I told you before, Charlemagne the God does not understand politics, and he does not understand history. Democratic defectors known as the Dixiecrats started a switch to the Republican Party in a movement that was later fueled by a so-called Southern strategy. Okay, so let's look at this history. Now, here's President Lyndon Johnson. The night that Democratic President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that was July 1964, his special assistant, Bill Moyers, was surprised to find the president looking melancholy in his bedroom. Moyers later wrote that when he asked what was wrong, President Johnson replied, quote, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come," end quote. It may seem a crude remark to make after such a momentous occasion, but it was also an accurate prediction. To understand some of the reasons the South went from a largely Democratic region to a primarily Republican area today, just follow the decades of debate over racial issues in the United States. Okay, so April 11, President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Bill of 1968. This is 1968. This is 3 days after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. Okay, so that was the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Within the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was the first Hate Crimes Act in the history of this country. The first Hate Crimes Act of the history of this country was passed largely for African Americans. So all these people out here who are saying we need an anti-black hate crime bill don't understand history and don't understand law. The first Hate Crimes Act in the history of this country was largely for African Americans. And if you want some information on that, at justice.gov, which is the official website of the Department of Justice, they have a section there dealing with hate crimes. And where is that one? It's this one right here. I want the one on hate crimes. I'll pull that up. You can look at hold on, we'll pull this up here. Just a second, I want to show you this piece. There's another one that deals with the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crime Act. We know that James Byrd was the African-American man in Jasper, Texas, who was killed. There is one that I had bookmarked that deals with hate crimes. And I'll find that one because that deals with the history, some of the history of hate crimes. I'm going to see if I can find that. Okay, I'll find that one. I had that one bookmarked. I don't know where that one is. But all right, let's continue here. Hate crimes, civil rights. Is it under the Civil Rights Division? What I want? Okay, I have to find it. Let's continue here. All right. What the hell just happened? Okay. All right, we're back. All right, let's go back to this piece here from history.com. Okay, the Republican Party was originally founded in the mid-1800s to oppose immigration and the spread of slavery. Says David Goldfield, whose new book on American politics, The Gifted Generation, When Government Was Good, comes out in November. So it came out November 2019. The Republican Party was strictly a sectional party, meaning that it just did not exist in the South. The South could not care less about immigration, but it did care about preserving slavery. It did care about preserving slavery. After the Civil War, the Democratic Party's opposition to Republican Reconstruction legislation solidified its hold on the South. Quote, the Democratic Party came to be more than a political party in the South. It came to be a defender of a way of life, Goldfield says. And that way of life was the restoration as much as possible of white supremacy. The Confederate statues you see all around were primarily erected by Democrats. Okay. Now, up until the post-World War II period, so World War II ends in 1945, the party's hold on the region, the Democratic Party's hold on the region was so entrenched that Southern politicians usually could not get elected unless they were Democrats. But when President Harry S. Truman, a Democratic Southerner, introduced a pro-civil rights platform at the Democratic Party's 1948 convention, a faction of the Democratic Party walked out of the convention. That faction was known as Dixiecrats. These defectors, known as Dixiecrats, held a separate convention in Birmingham, Alabama. There, at that separate convention, they nominated Southern Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond, who was a staunch opposer to civil rights. They nominated him as their candidate to run for president on their states' rights ticket. Although Strom Thurmond lost the election to Harry S. Truman, he still won over 1 million popular votes. Quote, it was the first time since before the U.S. Civil War, the U.S. Civil War starts in 1861, that the South was not solidly Democratic, Goldfield says, and that began the erosion of the Southern influence in the Democratic Party. After that, the majority of the South still continued to vote Democratic because it thought of the Republican Party as the party of Lincoln and the party of Reconstruction. The big break did not come until President Johnson, another Southern Democrat, signed the Civil Rights Act in 64 and the Voting Rights Act in 65. Now, 2/3 of African Americans had already switched over because we voted heavily for President Kennedy in that 1960 presidential election. And it was the African American vote that basically puts him over the top, and he defeats Richard Nixon in 1960. Though some Democrats had switched to the Republican Party prior to this, quote, the defections became a flood after President Johnson signed these acts, Goldfield says. So the party realignment goes back to 1928. And you have this shifting. Strom Thurmond is going to leave the Democratic Party and go over to the Republican Party where he dies. And so the political parties began to reconstitute themselves. Now, the change was not total or immediate. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, white Southerners were still transitioning away from the Democratic Party. Newly enfranchised African-American Southerners voted and continued to vote Democratic. And even as Republican Richard Nixon employed a Southern strategy that appealed to the racism of the Southern white voters, former Alabama Governor George Wallace, who wanted segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, ran as a Democrat in the 1972 presidential primaries. Now, Governor George Wallace ran for president in 1968 as a third party candidate against Richard Nixon. Governor George Wallace got 46 electoral college votes. He won 5 former Confederate states, including his state of Alabama. That was the last time a third party candidate has won a single electoral college vote. It was 1968. So all these people out here talking about third party, you do not understand history and you don't understand how the electoral college works. We talked about that on Roland Martin Unfiltered. You go to my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, Imhotep. I have the video breaking down how the electoral college works and what happens if no candidate gets 270 electoral college votes. It goes to the House of Representatives to determine who's going to be the president. It goes to the Senate to vote to determine who will be vice president. And in the House of Representatives, they vote by delegation. There are 50 delegations. There's one delegation per state. Republicans control 26 of the 50 delegations. And all you need is a simple majority, 26 out of 50. Therefore, if Donald Trump loses the popular vote again, and if he loses the electoral college vote like he did in 2020, if Biden does not get 270 electoral college votes, then it's up to the House of Representatives to determine by delegation. And the Republicans in 26 of those delegations, they can vote for Donald Trump and he can become president again, having lost the popular vote and the electoral college vote. Because Republicans control the House of Representatives as of now, unless they, Mike Gallagher is leaving this week. Ken Buck, I think, just left. Ken Buck, a Colorado Republican, just left. So the margin is steadily shrinking in Republican margin in the House of Representatives is steadily shrinking. Who knows? They may not be able to hold on, but this is too serious to throw away a vote on a third party candidate, especially when you don't understand how the Electoral College works. Okay, go to LOC.gov and read the U.S. Constitution, because the U.S. Constitution explains all this. This is where all this comes from, the U.S. Constitution, LOC.gov or archives.gov, which is the U.S. National Archives website. Okay, so read the rest of this article here. Okay, by the time Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, the Republican Party's hold on white Southerners was firm. The Republican Party's hold on white Southerners was firm. Today, the Republican Party remains the party of the South. It's an ironic outcome considering that a century ago, white Southerners would have never considered voting for the party of Lincoln. Okay, so read this article now. The Lily White movement in 1928 was a Southern strategy that Republicans used to appeal to Southern segregationist Democrats in 5 former Confederate states to get them to vote for Herbert Hoover, which was the Republican candidate for president. Okay. And it worked. It was a Southern strategy. So when Candace Owens talks about a Southern strategy didn't exist, she doesn't understand history. Yes, it does. It worked then, and it worked with Richard Nixon in 1968. Okay, now, just say, give me a minute. Give us a thumbs up. Give us a heart. Give us a like on this broadcast. Have you learned anything? I'm sure you learned a lot because we dealt with a lot of history here. Okay, I'm going through looking at my articles, make sure I covered all this and looking at my notes. Just give me a minute because I spent a lot of time preparing this presentation, so I want to make sure I get through everything. Okay, we talked about President Johnson's great society programs. Now, next time I'm going to deal with Donald. I'll talk about her comments about Donald Trump, and she says she's going to vote for this insurrectionist again. She's stuck on stupid. She's going to vote for this insurrectionist. After all Trump has done, she's going to vote for this insurrectionist again. We're going to deal with the lie that Trump is better for the economy and all that stuff. Okay, we'll deal with that. next time, because I wanted to be focused here because there's a lot to cover. Let's see. And let me show you this one right here. So you remember me saying that when it comes to these conservatives, especially these black conservatives, they always want it to come down to personal responsibility. Okay. They don't want to focus really on leveling the playing field, admitting systemic racism really exists, having policies to address it, anything like that. It always comes down to personal responsibility, and you just need to try harder, etc. Now, they don't, when you study the history of this country, policies put in place, there were policies put in place to help white people. Whether it's the Homestead Act of 1862, whether it's the policies from the New Deal, from President Roosevelt, things like that, right? There were the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. There was I think it was a Gallup poll that came out, and Newsweek.com had this article where 40% of white Americans said that African Americans could be equally as successful as white people if they just tried harder. If they just tried harder. Now, this sounds like something that Republicans, especially Senator Tim Scott, you know, Republican conservative grifters like Candace Owens would say. This sounds like something they would say. Let's look at this here. Because they really don't want to deal with history. They really don't want to deal with the history of racism in this country and how policies have now distributed wealth, power, and resources into the hands of Europeans. 40% of whites think black people just need to try harder, poll finds. April 4th, 2018. This is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. And a new YouGov poll shows that YouGov asked a number of questions of what it called racial resentment, and one of which centered on whether the respondent agreed with the statement. It's really a matter of some people not trying hard enough. If blacks would only try harder, they could be just as well off as whites. So in this poll, they found that 40% of white respondents agreed, 19% strongly, 21% somewhat. They agreed that black people just needed to try harder to be equal. If being equal in this country or being successful in this country was a matter of trying harder, nobody would be more successful than African Americans, because who worked harder than a slave for 246 years? Who worked harder than somebody picking cotton on a plantation in Mississippi, where Fannie Lou Hamer picked cotton on a plantation until she was fired from the Marlowe plantation because she registered to vote? Who worked harder than a domestic? Who worked harder than a maid or a butler or a washerwoman or African Americans working as cooks and things of this nature? If it just came down to trying harder, working harder, African Americans will be the most successful people in the history of this country. But we know that's a lie. That's not the case. All right, so hopefully you learned a lot here today. Thanks for watching. Like I said, we are celebrating the 14th year anniversary of me broadcasting the African History Network show. And I've been doing this type of research 14 years. We started March 10th, 2010 on the Harambe Radio Network. Then I went to Blog Talk. I've done nationally syndicated radio. That's how I connected with Warren Ballantyne and Roland Martin and Dave Anderson. I've done local radio here in Detroit for 7 years, the African History Network show on 9:10 a.m. Superstation WFDF. But visit our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. You can register for the online history classes that I teach on Saturdays. And I put together this curriculum. I've been studying history 32, 33 years. I know I look younger than I am. I'll be 53 June 7th, 2024. This is a 10-week online history class that I teach ancient Kemet, one of the original names for Egypt, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. Okay, so we deal with thousands of years of history and what leads up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. We have the course outline here. I've been teaching this class on and off for 7 years. We have the whole class lesson plan laid out so you can see the content that we deal with. Next class, Saturday, March 30th, then April 6th, April 13th, April 20th, then April 27th. We do the sessions live. All the sessions are archived and recorded. You can go back and watch it anytime. Also, you can, and we have the show right here on our Facebook, on our website for today's show. Listen to the African History Network show Sundays, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Facebook and YouTube. We're also on iHeartRadio. Download the iHeartRadio app, and we'll be uploading some more audio podcasts in the next few days. So wherever you get your podcast from, I'm on Stitcher, TuneIn, CastBox, FM Player, iHeart, iTunes, Blog Talk Radio. And then you can also support the African History Network, $, the AHN Show through Cash App. This is our official Cash App account, $, the AHN Show through Cash App. Also through PayPal, paypal.me/the AHN Show. I had to create this graphic because some people created some fake African History Network Cash App accounts out there, so they've been stealing money from us. This is our official Cash App tag. So when you go to it, it says Michael and shows my picture there. And if you click here on the link, it shows our QR code here also. Okay. So this helps us keep doing the research, stay on the air, keep broadcasting, pay some of the bills. And you can register for our online history course because I teach it. There are 2 digital platforms that I teach the course on. And we have to pay each month. It's not free for me to teach these classes. Okay. I have to pay each month to teach those. We're on Learn World is where the classes are housed, and we broadcast through Crowdcast. So there are 2 online platforms that I use to teach these classes also. All right. So look, that's going to do it for us. Next Sunday, we'll get into part 2 of this discussion and deal with the nonsense she was talking about dealing with Donald Trump and how Republicans are better for the economy and Trump was better for black people, all that. She told a bunch of damn lies. All right. Let me leave you with this as well. You've heard me talk about this on the African History Network show. And since we're talking about politics, I'm going to show this to you here because I deal with facts and evidence, right? This is not an endorsement, but I deal with facts and evidence. And I like to show people what it is I'm talking about. I tell people, you don't have to believe a word that I say. Proper documentation ends all conversation. So I've mentioned this on Roland Martin Unfiltered a number of times, as well as here on the show. And we've actually gone through this document here on the African History Network show. This is now this came out February 27, 2023. And I'm the only person I know of who's dealt with this in media, who's actually really talked about it and taken people through it. This is a 36-page document at whitehouse.gov that takes you through category by category that shows you how the policies of the Biden-Harris administration are helping African Americans. It's called Fact Sheet. The Biden-Harris administration advances equity and opportunity for Black Americans and communities across the country. These policies, overwhelmingly Republicans either voted against if they passed Congress, or they are against if these are policies coming from the White House. Okay. So they talk about everything from the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan that no Republicans in the House or the Senate voted for. And we know the child tax credit in the American Rescue Plan lifted 1 million African-American children out of poverty. It talks about the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act. Everything talks about the Imhotep anti-lynching bill, talks about the $5.8 billion for HBCUs in 2021, over $7 billion in total for HBCUs. It talks about lowest unemployment rate for African Americans since it's been tracked going back to 1972, which took place in 2023, et cetera. Just go through and look at this. It goes through category by category and shows how the policies of the Biden-Harris administration are helping the African American community. Now compare this to what any Republican is saying, what any third party candidate is saying, what Candace Owens, what Senator Tim Scott, what any of these black grifters out here are saying. Just compare the facts to what they're saying. Okay. And if you just Google, if you do something as simple as Google, how have the policies of the Biden-Harris administration helped the African American community? This is one of the first documents that come up. So it's like, I don't understand how people don't know. Because I go to whitehouse.gov, official website of the White House. I do research there. But I Googled, how have the policies of the Biden-Harris administration helped the African American community? And this was the first thing that came up. Now, the first version of this was October 2021. And they kept putting out different versions of it. They kept expanding it. They have one from February 2024, which is a streamlined one, which is about 9 pages. So it's more condensed to explain it to people. But I like to go, let's deal with a 36-page document. Let's deal with a 36-page one. And let's compare this to what anybody else is saying out here. All right, that's going to do it for us. Remember, at the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world, because right now it corrects wrong behavior. What you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, and what you allow other people to do to you and get away with is based upon what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself is based upon what you have been taught about yourself. What you've been taught about yourself is based upon everything you've read, heard, and seen about yourself. Right now it corrects wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. Wakanda forever. And we'll talk to you next week. Peace.